Good morning and welcome to our STEM Salon on that ever-important vowel in the word STEM. You've probably seen the same slide I have at some meeting somewhere or another where they write STEM and they use different point size for the letters S-T-E-M. S is quite big, M is even bigger because that's really in elementary school. The T is sort of so-so, but that E is pretty small. And that's really what we want to look at today. We want to better understand the current landscape in K-12 engineering learning. And we want to also hypothesize and explore what the future may hold. Several folks have been saying, so we've tried to write Chapter 1. The question is, what might Chapter 2 and Chapter 10 and so forth be as well. And we're going to hear from some real experts in a moment. I just wanted to set the stage a tad more than we have. As you know, Change the Equation is a coalition of about 100 companies, all of who've joined for their unique reasons. But one of the major issues that has prompted them to join is the whole issue of their workforce. Most of our companies, regardless of their actual core competency, in fact, employ a significant number of engineers, or recovering engineers may be the case in some places. And we hear lots of tales of we can't find the engineers that we need. It's really a workforce problem, and it's not just 4-year degrees, but it's also 2-year degrees that lead to knowledge and expertise in engineering. Change the Equation tried very hard to unpack this because, as you know, there is an ongoing argument about whether or not there's really a workforce shortage. It's hard to get hold of that data. Economists would say, for example, that wages are not rising quickly enough in engineering to suggest there's a real shortage, because it is really an issue of supply and demand. So Change the Equation undertook a study that many of you may know, and there are copies at the back later, called STEM Help Wanted, where we tried to do a state-by-state analysis to really understand how many jobs were going unfilled and how many qualified folks were there to fill those jobs. Clearly, there's sometimes a geographic mismatch, and we're not able to fix that immediately. But I would just cite three little pieces of data that came out of that study. The first is that for those folks who are qualified in electronic and electrical engineering, nationwide there are 1.3 jobs open. So there is more than one job for each person. For those who are in industrial health and safety engineering, there are 3 open jobs. Just talking about qualifications and jobs. But it's not the same across all engineering, and I would cite civil engineering as our example. In civil engineering, the situation is much worse. There are about 2 civil engineers for every 1 posting. The hypothesis is this is partly due to the recession and the lack of infrastructure building in states and districts and so forth. So in fact, this may turn around, and that's another issue of workforce, that the pendulum certainly swings. But we certainly recognize that we have a critical of qualified individuals in engineering writ large, but more importantly, we want every young person to be literate in engineering and to, regardless of their career, even if they go on to be Shakespearean actors, to better be able to understand what's going on the set and the whole mechanics behind something like that. Broadly, as you probably know, many of our students reach college without any real exposure to hands-on engineering, or in some cases, even understanding what engineers do. They're not just the folks who drive the subways. So it's very difficult for a student to opt in to engineering, to think about going in as a freshman into the engineering program, or even to prepare themselves with the coursework K-12 if you don't really even know what the job is. And that's what we want to talk about. But I'm not the expert, I'm just the storyteller to set the stage. Let me first introduce the panel and then talk a little bit about how we're going to go through this. On my far left is Greg Pearson, Senior Program Officer at the National Academy of Engineering. Greg has directed several projects looking at engineering education, including the 2010 report Standards for K-12 Engineering Education and the 2009 report Engineering in K-12 Education, Understanding and Improving the Prospects. So he brings a great deal of wisdom to this. Seated on the other end of this panel is Arthur Camins, Director of the Center for Innovation in Engineering and Science Education. Arthur is currently the co-investigator of a math and science partnership project aimed at enhancing the content knowledge of 3rd through 8th grade teachers, with a particular focus on improving the links between science education and engineering. Next to Arthur is Christine Cunningham, Vice President at the Museum of Science in Boston. Christine oversees curriculum development and teacher training through a variety of outlets at the Museum of Science. Principal among them is Engineering is Elementary, the program she founded in 2003 and Change the Equation is proud to include in its database of effective programs, STEMworks. Justina Nixon-Saintil is the Director for Education at Verizon, a proud member, I hope, of Change the Equation. Justina is an engineer by training. She leads Verizon's work in both K-12 and higher education, including Verizon's partnership with the National Academy Foundation Engineering Academy, which gives high school students extensive training in engineering fields. I should also say that the National Academy Foundation program is included in our STEMworks database as well. You can find more information on our panelists, because I've just scratched the surface, at your seat. We thought we'd try something a little different at this STEM Salon. Yes, there's plenty of time for you to ask questions, and several of you have already come up to me to say you have a long list of questions. Folks, these people are primed. But we'd like to try a different format than those of you who've been our faithful attendees may be accustomed to. I'm actually going to moderate about 45 minutes of questions, which some or all of the panelists may opt to answer. We're going to ask that folks keep their answers pretty terse and pretty to the point and respond to one another, including disagreeing with one another. We like to get a little bit feisty here, so we welcome that. And we hope that when that's concluded, it will lead to some very rich and thoughtful discussion and Q&A from you folks. So with that, I'll take my seat back there. If my panelists could hit the button to turn the mic on. The button is right here. Oh, there it is. There you go. So let's start with the hard one. What is the E in STEM? I mean, STEM's a great word. It's the best acronym we've had in my career, that's for sure. You would say from other fields, it's especially good. You can put an A in, you can put an R in, you still have a word. I know folks want to put an H in. I don't know how to pronounce that word. But really, if we just look at STEM, what is the E? And if you didn't know as much mathematics as you know, and were a betting person, my question is, what do you think is the chance that engineering will take a more prominent role at the pre-college level in the next few years? What would you wager?
Well, overall, I'm optimistic, but with reservations. And since we're talking about engineering, I'll use a lever metaphor. The rock is that we're trying to lift is what I would think of as a more inclusive education for students that would include engineering. And so pushing down on the end of the lever are the next generation science standards, which try to make that E larger. The issue you were speaking of earlier about the workforce needs, and I think some research which indicates that a more active and connected way of learning will enhance students' learning of science. On the other end, sitting on top of the rock, which represents the students, are some other things, and I think that are pushing in the other direction. And I think those are the continued emphasis on testing, reading, and math, which restricts time. I think the ongoing debate about teacher evaluation is doing the same thing. I think both of those things make people risk averse, and making the E larger for many people, I think, is seen as a risk. And then finally, I think kids' own self-concept about whether they can do the hard work of thinking about and doing science and engineering is also a weight. And I think we have to address all of those things in order to help lift that rock.
Well, we've seen over the past 10 years that engineering can get into the classroom. I mean, we've made huge strides. If you told me in 2003 that we would ever see engineering in our new frameworks, I would not have bet on that. So that leads me to be hopeful that it will get into the standards in some way, shape, or form, and into classrooms in some way, shape, or form. Like Arthur, I think there's lots of pressures that push against it. Standardized tests worry me greatly, particularly when you start talking about engineering. And I think the other concern that I have is, what is engineering going to look like in the classroom? So we would like to see open, active, engaging projects that kids are doing. On the other extreme, you could have standardized tests where kids are thinking about the 4 kinds of forces that act on fill-in-the-blank bridges. I'd rather have no engineering than the latter, because it's just going to turn kids away from the field. So I think it's incredibly important that as we think about what we're putting into classrooms, we think about the reasons why we want the children to engineer. They're very aligned with 21st century skills, with problem solving, developing innovation and creativity, which we know is crucial to our sort of success in the future, whether the children become engineers or whether they go on to lead a business or whether they become a politician or something else. Those kinds of skills, I think, are very useful. And so I hope as we move forward that there's a conversation about what this looks like and what the ends for engineering are beyond just sending kids into a set of standardized tests and a workforce.
Yeah, I would just add that I would bet that engineering is more integrated in a high school curriculum or a high school setting before K-12 or even, K-5 or even K-8. And that's the comfort level of teachers. If you talk about engineering and you think about a teacher who has a liberal arts degree, trying to integrate just even a project in that classroom, I think it's very difficult for a teacher to do if they do not have the ground in engineering or even in math and science. So I think a lot of teachers who have that in middle school and high school are more comfortable doing these types of activities in school. So I would definitely bet at high school levels, maybe middle school levels, you'll see more engineering in the future. My concern is K-5, because that's when you really need to engage the students and get them interested. By the time you get to middle school and high school, if they're not very interested in a STEM career in general, I think it's really hard to get them engaged then.
Okay. The only thing I would add 2 things. One is that my impression is that although we don't know what the engineering content will be in those new science standards yet, because the final version hasn't been published, if I were betting, Linda, I would bet that most of the attention, rightly so, going forward from that point in the science community particularly, will be on how to deal with the changes that have been proposed for science education. And for the most part, I think engineering will play a minor, if somewhat inappropriately sort of minor and possibly even no role, depending on the state or district and what ultimately happens across the country. So So my perspective is that while we need to pay attention to those standards, there's plenty of work going on, and that has been going on in the country, much of it, some of it represented at this table, that will continue, not irrespective of the standards, but maybe in spite of what happens with those standards. The only other thing I would add is that there is also a growing cohort of education researchers that have been working. Christine is one of them. There are some cognitive scientists as well who have been looking at how engineering design in particular can connect to and encourage conceptual understanding in science and math, for example. And so it's not just the curriculum piece, but there is actually a small but very competent group of education and cognitive scientists who are doing work that I think will begin to establish a firmer kind of evidence base for the value of engineering that I think will be useful not only for engineering educators, but for those interested in STEM.
So let's talk about engineering in formal education. For those of you who were here last month, we did talk about out-of-school programs, and there's lots of engineering going on there, but at least the focus among this panel is in school. And we heard one point of view that says we might be looking at high school for ways to integrate it. Why don't we talk about that? I mean, where does engineering, or what does it mean? What is engineering when you think about K-5, 5-8, or K-4, 5-8 high school? What does that even mean?
You wanted us to argue a little bit, so
Yes, I do.
Maybe push back a little bit against the premise that it might be easier in middle and high school. Some of you may know there was a report just released, I think it was last week, by Horizon Research. It was kind of on the state of science education and science and math education in the United States. And their data, there was something like, I think in middle school, 7%, and in high school, 14% of teachers who had ever taken an engineering course. And it was minuscule at the elementary level, maybe 1%. But more interestingly, only about 6% said they felt they were prepared. And so the level of confidence and preparation, kind of across the board, is pretty low. And I think obviously there's a huge need for professional development. But there are pressures at the elementary level because the elementary teachers have to teach so many things. There are pressures in middle and high school because even though they're only teaching presumably one thing, there's still pressure to teach a lot of things. And whether the intention notwithstanding, whether the next generation science standards actually reduce the number of things that people need to teach in order to get to depth is arguable. And so I think there are issues, all along the spectrum about the inclusion of engineering. And so, time is a precious, resource, and so unless we give people, I think, the space that they need all across to begin to experiment, because I think this idea of including engineering as part of science education, in my view at least, it's the place to go if we expect to get it done. But teachers will need space to experiment and try it out without a lot of pressure for it to work.
Help me here on one thing. How will I know if I'm visiting a classroom when I'm learning about engineering going on? I mean, how am I going to recognize it? What does engineering in K-12 even look like?
I think it looks like hands-on projects in the classroom. So whether they're building a bridge, the simplest one is an egg drop and things like that you can do in the younger years. But even, when you get into middle school and high school, robotics, all of that. I think the way I would look at it is if you walk into a class and there are teams of students working on a hands-on activity and they're talking about math principles and science principles, I think that's my concept of what an engineering course looks like. And I do believe that it needs to be integrated in the regular science curriculum. But even if you think about math, there's a lot that you could do in a math class that incorporates engineering. So overall, in high school, and I have a son who's in middle school, so I'm not yet in high school, and I have two kids in in the lower elementary levels. In high school, I know there are a lot of schools that have an elective where you have a separate engineering class, and in my son's middle school, you have a technology class. But I disagree with that, especially when you get to the lower levels. I think it has to be incorporated right into the regular math and science curriculum and incorporate those design activities right there where the kids are solving a problem and talking about how math and science principles are incorporated into whatever design that they're working on.
Other thoughts?
Well, I have to jump in about the K through 12 and where it fits. I was where Justina was about 2003. In fact, when the way that engineering as elementary started, and I'd only done middle school and high school, is I kind of inherited a pot of grant money because various people left. And having only worked at the high school and middle school because I was firmly based in content, I thought, oh, gracious. We're having a hard time with middle school and high school teachers and their content, and now you want me to go to elementary school where the teachers know even less about science. And then work with them. And I thought, well, I'll be a good steward. And in a year from now, this grant will be over, thankfully, and I can go back and back to my teachers in middle school and high school. Because I just thought it was going to be impossible to get elementary teachers to do engineering. And I could not have been more wrong. It is, in my experience, so much easier to get engineering at the elementary school level, both for the teachers and for the students. For a couple of reasons, and also caveat, depends upon what engineering looks like at the elementary level. So the biggest challenge, I think, at the elementary level is helping the teachers to understand that engineering does not equal calculus. You don't need big, fancy, incredibly scientific pieces of information. I mean, they'll tell us we're afraid of science, we are terrified of engineering. I have teachers who don't sleep the night before they come to a workshop because they're so afraid of what they're doing. And so part of it is helping them to understand that, at least in our view, at the elementary level, engineering really focuses on things like properties of materials. So I tell the teachers, you know almost everything you need to know about engineering right now. If I ask you what will work better to design a hand pollinator to pollinate flowers, a pom-pom or a marble to pick up the pollen, I think everyone in this room would know from experience that pom-poms are more likely to pick up pollen than marbles are. That is not something that a 5 or 6-year-old knows. They will have to experiment with their world. So one of the things that we're trying to do at the elementary level is help kids build that everyday knowledge about properties of materials that we as adults already possess. We're trying to help them do it in a scaffolded way, but it makes sense. So if you can get over the initial teacher, oh my gracious, this is so scary. In general, at the elementary school level, teachers are much more used to teaching multiple subjects, and they'll tell you they don't have time and they can't do it, and it's, how they're going to fit it in, and then they try it the first time, and the kids start lobbying for it, and the kids are learning, and they can integrate it with other things, and all of a sudden it sort of takes on a life of its own. So I actually think it's easier, and the kids are much more used to trying things, having things not work. They're far more creative than most kids in the AP classes are. We actually have more trouble shaking those AP kids into innovation because they've been trained by the system that there's a right answer and this is how you do it. So I like to say that all kids engineer, and we've educated it out of them, and now we have to help them move forward and bring those to life. So to me, it's sort of active with a goal in mind, and then the teachers are very, very good at integrating back into the rest of the class.
I just wanted to add one other thing to kind of expand upon the idea. Certainly, if I went into a classroom, I would want to see kids engaged actively in doing things which we would normally call hands-on, but hands-on isn't enough. And with respect to engineering, trial and error isn't enough. So I want to see some evidence of some systematic thinking on the part of the kids, and them being able to explain and defend the design choices that they're making, and referencing some science principles, maybe the difference between a marble and a pom-pom,
Right.
and why that's a better choice. So I think it's the thinking and reasoning that I think is and the context that engineering provides that I think is its power, and that's really what I'm going to be looking for.
So how are we going to recognize success? I mean, we're beginning to get a feel of what it looks like, but how are we going to know that we, the royal we, been successful? I'm sorry, I know that's
Tough
tough.
question. You can do some research and evaluation, and you could survey the kids and find out if they're more interested in, engineering careers because of some of the projects and some of the work they're doing in the classroom. It's just hard to track that over time. We have a program now where we working with kids on app development, and we want to know if after they're completed developing a concept into an app, and they go through logic and all the things that you need to learn to do that, are you more interested in a STEM career? But even if we do the survey now, how do we know that they actually go into a STEM career? And that's the difficult part to figure out. Even if they do say they're more interested, they want to learn more about STEM, we have no way of knowing if they actually do that. And that's the issue with, getting some outcomes from some of the programs and figuring out if it has an impact long term.
Well, I think it obviously also depends on what, you're defining as what the goal would be. And you've mentioned a couple goals. There are interest, motivation, certainly achievement, in quotes, as measured by standardized tests is another kind of metric that is being used or has been used. I would just mention one thing, though, that some of you are probably aware of, but that could provide some interesting opportunity, at least, for tracking at a fairly high level the nation's children's understanding of engineering, and that is that the National Assessment of Educational Progress in 2014, next year, will pilot the first ever assessment of technology and engineering literacy. It is being piloted in 8th grade students, a sample across the country, with the possibility that it will be expanded to grade levels below and above 8th grade, depending on what the board of this organization, which is advisory to the education department. This is the organization or the group that does the annual or periodic assessments of math, English language arts, reading, geography, and so on. It's the basis on which we often compare ourselves to other nations, as well as states compare themselves to one another. So it's at least in theory possible, Linda, that over time, if we have an assessment that is done periodically with some consistent questions across time, that we might actually observe some changes in this domain. And by the way, this assessment for the first time also is making an effort to use assessment items that are more open-ended and that have elements of design problems, although for reasons of the constraints of the test itself and the time that it takes and money, it's not as open-ended as one might wish, but it's nevertheless, it goes beyond or is more extensive and challenging than a simple selected item response or multiple choice test. So that's something that I think we should all pay attention to.
Success.
This one's pretty big, I would say, which is that there's a fairly prevalent and deep-seated notion about who can become scientists and engineers. That it takes, what Carol Dweck calls a fixed mindset. Somehow what your success and smarts are a product of genes or kind of fixed experiences. And I think engaging students in the kinds of activities that are being described begin to push back against that, but only if the educators and the kids themselves come to believe that you can get smart by working at it. And so I think changing that mindset will address some of the issues that you raised at the very beginning about the number of folks who even consider going into engineering and who considers going into engineering, because as I'm sure people in the room well know, the statistics on women and engineers and on minorities and engineers are, I guess they've gotten a little better, but nowhere near enough. And so that idea about who can become an engineer and who can become a scientist and what it takes to do so, I think, maybe is our biggest obstacle, and we got to work at it in pretty explicit ways.
So the kind of things that we look for, and we have standardized tests that we can give to children and show that they can perform better when they do our activities. But I think the real ways that we can see that kids are engaged with engineering are much more fine-grained. They have much more to do with observation of students. So we know when we walk into a classroom whether or not the kids have done engineering previously. It's really obvious. And it's obvious from things like they know a way to approach problems. They know how to persist. When something goes wrong, they just don't throw their hands up. They're used to going back and say, oh, engineers always, encounter problems, so we're going to try something else. They're able to sometimes, because these are also little kids, think back and make decisions about what they could try next, and hopefully what data that they've collected can help them reach that next step. They're comfortable describing what they've done to other people and are able to ask questions of other kids about what they've done. So it's sort of a range of behaviors that we're trying to develop, that some of which are very difficult, if not impossible, to capture on a standardized test. But the teachers that we work with will tell us with each iteration of doing an open-ended problem, the kids get better at it, to the point that they ask adults, like, what do you mean we should be concerned about it not having worked? It's not supposed to work. It's engineering. We're going to keep trying it, and each time it's going to get better. So instilling that kind of mindset, not only about engineering, but because we're also at the elementary level, we think very, broadly, think about it as problem-solving, innovation, and persistence. So we consider it successful if a kid will come out of our class and they're able to say, the window is stuck. How am I going to open it? If they can think about some fairly logical, data-driven way to solve that problem, in a sense, that's an engineering habit of mind. Even if they never go out and take another engineering class post, high school. So if we can develop that kind of problem-solving ability to go in there, think about the data they have, and then make decisions based upon that, to me, that would be, the ultimate success for this generation of kids.
In 2009, the report that the National Academy of Engineering came out with identified 3 principles of engineering education, and we've heard a little bit about them. One is that it should emphasize design. Secondly, it should incorporate science, technology, and mathematics. And third, that it should promote habits of mind. So my question to the panelists is, do you think this has changed? Do you think this has proven to be the right pathway? And an extra question is, does higher education look at these 3 principles and judge them to be appropriate as an introduction? And I'll just give a quick anecdote. Back in the 90s, we were talking about calculus being a pump, not a filter, in terms of trying to get more students through calculus, regardless of what their career was. This was in high school. And there was calculus for a new century, really changing the way we were teaching calculus. What we were hearing from higher ed, and my background is mathematics, what we were hearing from higher ed is, don't let those high school teachers teach calculus, because I have to redo it. So that's a context. Greg, you want to?
I don't think fundamentally those 3 principles, as they were called, have changed. I think the the most difficult from a data and evidence point of view of the 3 to, as we've already sort of touched on, to demonstrate is the connection, meaningful connection to math and science, as opposed to casual and sort of unproductive contact with those subjects. That is, the integration itself is very difficult to do and difficult to document its impact. The other thing I would say is sort of flipping the challenge a bit to your question, Linda, is there is some thinking, although I admit that it's probably a very small group, that suggests that as engineering, as we've talked about it here, becomes more common in K through 12, and students come to understand the essential nature of engineering, as Christine has described it, which is really a habit of mind that's applicable in a lot of domains, and that involves dealing with some open-ended problems and being creative and doing projects. And they arrive at the typical engineering college. There are about 320 of them around the country, the majority of which still are structured in a rather traditional way, in that they provide high-level math and science pretty much exclusively, at least the first 2 years, sometimes all the way through the junior year, before giving students a chance to experience a design project. That there's going to be a disconnect by those students who feel they have understood and actually enjoy what they've been told is engineering, but then discover when they get into an undergraduate program that it doesn't look anything like that. And in fact, that's to some extent already a problem. As some of you know, roughly 50% of engineering students leave the degree programs, not because they can't hack it. In fact, the GPAs of the leavers versus the stayers is almost identical. But there are other things, other problems, and a lot of the best thinking on this subject suggests that it is the lack of connection to relevance that the engineering programs are suffering from. So anyway, I think that there is a disconnect. There may be an expectation by engineering programs that, just as you say, that either engineering is being done poorly or that they're going to have to redo it. But I think another aspect of the problem is that the engineering schools themselves are being put in a position, actually, it's an opportunity in a way for them to change, but I'm not sure that they are.
I totally agree. In fact, I was going to state that 50% dropout rate, which I experienced when I went to engineering school. And you don't actually start doing any hands-on real engineering design work until almost junior year in college. And by then, you've lost a lot of kids who are really interested in engineering, but they spend the first 2 years in, 100, student classrooms talking about theory. So I actually think that you need the hands-on work we're talking about, the actual engineering design needs to happen, in colleges of engineering also, as we want them to happen in K-12. I absolutely agree.
I want to go back a little bit to the idea of engineering integration at the K through 12 level. I think if we have any hope of engineering becoming a ubiquitous part of students' learning, then that's the place to do it, given all the demands. But I think it is extraordinarily complex, underappreciated how complex it is. Most engineering problems are complicated. They've got all sorts of different features of science that children may or may not have learned. So in the real world, engineers assemble a team of people with different kinds of expertise, deep expertise, and they draw upon all that to come up with solutions. At the K through 12 level, kids are not expert at much of anything yet. And so the idea of selecting the engineering problem to engage students in, which is either going to push them to learn more science or find a reason to learn some basic ideas of science or to make use of them, is pretty complicated. And we don't yet know a lot about a learning progression with respect to engineering concepts. And so there is plenty of room for research on that. And again, we need the time and space to do that. And I might add, before we rush to test the next generation science standards, which are which promote that idea. And so I think we kind of need to tap the brakes on that and give people the space that they need to do that basic experimentation and research.
So let me pose one more question before I hand you folks the mic to be the questioners, and that's the political landscape. Certainly early in my career, I thought education transcended politics. Okay, so I was naive. But that's certainly not the case in reality. And what I'm wondering is, in listening to you folks, when you define success, part of what you said was how many people go into engineering. And I'm wondering about how politically savvy it is to say we're talking about the next generation of engineers rather than raising the literacy, engineering literacy of all students, and particularly in this environment of accountability, assuming that we can get assessments that are of the quality we want.
You know, it's one of those, I'm glad you asked that question. You know, the argument around the economy certainly is a compelling one, but I think insufficient. I spent most of my career as a science educator, and so I'm kind of new to engineering, and I think in the beginning I was probably one of the resistors. I was thinking, you know, we're having a hard enough time to get them, teachers to engage in high-quality science education. Why add engineering? And I've really come around to a different point of view. And because if you look around at the room we're sitting in, virtually everything around us has been engineered. And so it's kind of insane, I think, in a way, not to engage kids in thinking about that and trying to get the public to understand the decision-making process that goes into all that design. And including in that are the value choices that go into the design of things like our food. There was an article some of you may have seen in the New York Times Sunday magazine this past Sunday about our engineered food. And so that, you know, healthcare, any of the climate change, any of the major issues that we're confronting, never mind, you know, needing a smaller group or a growing group of scientists and engineers, we need a public who can better understand and participate in those issues in an informed way. And so for me, that's the more important, you know, target that we ought to be thinking about.
For me, I firmly sit in the literacy camp. I spent a number of years before I started engineering as elementary, actually looking at the collegiate level, and specifically we were trying to figure out why women who had declared interest in engineering entering college left. So we looked at 27,000 women over 3 years. The result of that, I figured, you're not going to change higher ed, and that's where a big part of the problem is. And so the idea that somehow by sending more, you're going to get more through the pipeline, that's possible, but there's sort of a fundamental disconnect in the ways that schools of engineering currently teach. That might change, but my experiences there say it's harder to change those schools than it is the K-12 system, which is saying a lot. I don't think it's a really smart idea to link all the work that's going on at the K-12 to something that ultimately is the outcome's going to be decided at the higher education level. And furthermore, I don't really think that's the point of doing engineering at the K-12 level. We don't teach math because we're trying to raise the number of mathematicians in the country. We don't teach reading because we're trying to have more Nobel laureates come out of the country. Similarly, I don't think we need to teach engineering because we need more of a workplace. We do need more of a workplace, possibly, but I think the focus at K-12 is sort of exposure and developing larger habits of mind. And I mean, I get asked all the time, can you link, you know, an increase in kids going to engineering in college? I'm like, they're 5 years old. Like, we're getting them for 6 hours, you know, total. No, you know, we can make claims about their attitudes, but there's a lot of other societal and parental and, you know, factors going on that I think make it virtually impossible to make those connections. So I can sing that song when, you know, companies want us to sing the song, but truthfully, I think it's about a much bigger problem than, you know, developing engineers. If we have smart, talented people, I think a number of people who have sort of founded companies and done exciting things didn't necessarily get an engineering degree, and a number of people who got engineering degrees end up in other fields. So I would be incredibly careful about linking those two too tightly.
I'm one of the engineers who ended up in another field. However, we are one of the companies that want to get more engineers. I work for Verizon. We're a technology company, and we are really focused on getting that pipeline of engineers and, you know, innovators into the business. And a lot of what the programs we do, the job shadowing, the mentoring we do, is focused on helping middle school and high school students understand what an engineering job is. We bring them onto our campus. We have a lot of engineers, a lot of African American engineers, other minority engineers at Verizon, and we want to show young people that they can do it and they can attain this type of job, and they can get the skills that they need and the mentorship that they need. So we are working on increasing that pipeline of engineers. Of course, there are many other things that students do that use engineering skills, and they come in and work in other jobs at the company. But we are very interested in that pipeline. So we're very focused on programs that develop students and help students become engineers.
And I would just add or extend those remarks to say, I think another way to think about it is, rather than numbers, sort of we need more. Perhaps a different way, maybe a better way to think about it is, we need more diverse and more competent or creative engineers. Excuse me, I have a cold. From an economic point of view, I think it's generally recognized that the strength of the United States is in innovation. And not all of engineering is about innovation, but certainly it can be more about that, and that's sort of our claim to value added here. The other thing I would say is, politically speaking, the literacy argument, I am totally on board with that, by the way, Christine, like you. But from a political point of view, it's much harder to make. I mean, I think people nod their heads and sort of pay lip service to literacy, generally speaking, but they don't, when push comes to shove, it's the bottom line, literally or metaphorically, that matters. So I see this area as sort of like investing in basic research. You don't know what's going to end up producing results. You're going to have to invest for a long time, and it's going to be expensive. But in the long haul, it's worth it. The U.S. Congress, at least in the area of health, has bought into that after many years through NIH. But generally speaking, that's, I think, a hard argument to make in education, but that's sort of what we're saying. Invest in the long haul, because the benefits of literacy are hard to track, hard to predict, but will be valuable. But politically, I think that's kind of hard to make the case.
Your turn. If you could indicate that you have a question. I see Eric already has his hand up. And we're going to bring the mic to you. This is being taped, so we'd like you to speak into the mic and identify who you are, and please get to that question as quick as possible.
Thank you. Whoa, I'll back up a little bit. There we go. Thank you. Eric Roblin with the newspaper Education Week. I'll get straight to my question, I promise. 2 questions, if you don't mind, but they're related. One, and Greg, you may be one of the ones to deal with this since it has some bearing with standards, but I'm wondering if you can point to one or the few states where you think engineering has made the most headway at the K-12 level. My second question, which I'd love all of you to quickly answer, is to tell me about the most promising engineering program we've never heard of, and it has to be one that your organization is not involved with. But I'd love to hear what stuff is out there that we may not know about, but we probably should know about, even if it doesn't have a big research base yet.
I'm hesitant to declare, even though I know some of what's going on, with any certainty. I can't say, which states are sort of in the lead. That's a bit of a tricky question, of course, based on what we've been talking about in terms of, depends on what you define as ahead and how you measure it. But with that caveat, I will certainly give credit to the state of Massachusetts, Christine and her group, as well as others in the state. Tufts and at Worcester Polytechnic and others have really done, I think, a pretty amazing job of introducing engineering through a lot of professional development around the state. I would say also represented at this table, New Jersey. Again, largely, it's usually a key institution in the state, sometimes more than one, but usually one. In this case, Stevens Institute of Technology, I think, gets some credit there and has demonstrable numbers to demonstrate increased enrollment of teachers in professional development and success in that regard. There are about a dozen states that have included engineering formally in their science standards, and those are states probably that bear watching as the new standards roll out. I can't recite those states off the top of my head, but the 2010 report that Linda has mentioned out of the Academy of Engineering lists those states. There may be one or two that have been added since then. Those are the states I would watch because they, for whatever reasons, made a decision and had some level of understanding of the connection politically and in terms of programs to put science and engineering together. So then you asked about specific programs that nobody has heard of. I don't, I can't really do that either. I can't even pretend to say I can't do it and then do it, because there really are a lot of programs out there. There are some that are quite large that are well known. Christine's is one of them. Project Lead the Way is another. But there are a number of smaller efforts. I'd say the thing to look for is, in terms of quality, is for curriculum projects that have a strong research component. And off the top of my head, I would say there are probably maybe 24 or so that have survived for at least a couple of years that have data. And those are, I think, the programs that everyone would agree you'd want to follow. The 2009 report, although it's dated out of the Academies, describes a number of these projects, about 30 of them around the country.
The only program off the top of my head that I can think of that we're not intimately involved in is a program called Girls Who Code, which lends itself probably more to computer science than computer engineering, but there's so much overlap between those two disciplines that I would call it engineering. But they really get girls excited about app development and finding a problem to solve and designing and developing all the way to a complete app. Which I think is a really great way to excite and engage students in technology in general and in engineering.
Oh, I have the same problem Greg does. There's quite a few of them out there. I'd say, the National Academies, I know, Change the Equation has a list that was, having gone through that process, heavily vetted. It takes hours. They had an outside person sort of look at those reports, and that's where I would probably start for engineering. I know there's some science and some math as well, but those programs will have met those research standards that Greg responded to, because I do think that's a critical part. What is the evaluation and research saying? Getting back to your first question about the states, the two states I would say are really hot right now, at least in our experience. North Carolina is doing some just amazing things. They just put engineering in standards, and they are on fire as far as I'm concerned. And Minnesota is the other one that just seems to have a real statewide commitment to bringing this to school. So those are two states I would definitely look at.
I don't really have anything to add to that.
Okay. Next question. Gentleman right here.
Good morning. My name is Vijay Kautha. I work at the Naval Research Labs. For information, on March 8th, we have high school students and doing engineering design reviews at University of Maryland Kim Engineering. It's a club at University of Maryland called MACE, Mentors Advancing STEM Education. These are freshmen and sophomore engineers at College Park who go out in the community, and these students now will be presenting to the leadership. In terms of a question that I want to ask the panel, Christine is right. She talked about the elementary teachers are supportive of science. The data is from Reset, where I volunteer a lot, which we go to the elementary schools in the DC area. The high school middle school is a different problem altogether. So the question is to Arthur. Arthur, Stevens has been funded by Department of Defense for over the years for doing capstone systems engineering. The question that Christine posed, which is how do we educate our teachers? So can we have the School of Education in every university require a capstone program? Hey, if you're going to teach science in the school, are you prepared? Can you do a capstone program like what is required in universities for engineering? Would that make a difference, and how would you think it will happen?
I'm sorry, a capstone program
For the engineering students, no, for the College of Education students.
For College of Education students. I think the idea, it depends what the nature of that capstone project might be. I think curriculum development is an extraordinarily complicated business. And students who are just learning to be teachers, that's probably not the first thing they ought to be doing. They need to spend time in classrooms using the kind of models that Christine has developed. I would much rather have them do a capstone project, which might be an action research project using a curriculum like engineering as elementary, and really beginning to probe from a research perspective how that really plays out in a classroom. So I think the idea of a capstone project to me would be action research rather than, say, a curriculum development.
Question at the back, or back?
Hi, I'm Dennis Schatz from the National Science Foundation, and I was actually surprised no one mentioned the maker movement. It seems to have taken off dramatically around the country. Maker fairs, libraries are putting in maker centers, museums, and so on, and a lot of schools are too. So I'd like to get a sense of what you think the maker movement impact is going to be with the whole encouraging more engineering.
I actually didn't know it was in K-12 schools. I know it's in the informal environment quite a bit, and I think that certainly can feed the pipeline, but that's in schools. It's new to me, so I'd be very interested to learn more about how they're doing that. I think the general kinds of dispositions that they're encouraging certainly merge well with the kind of work we're doing in K-12. And so the question for me would be, as they move into the formal educational system, what sort of structures and more formalized overlay are they putting onto a program that right now is, has been founded in informal education? And so to get it into classrooms, there are going to be some sort of overarching structures that's going to help the teachers and the kids come away with the learnings that they're hoping to get. But if they can do that, I think it's fabulous. The little I've seen families and kids get involved, there's just not a lot of structure to help them pull out sort of those learnings that they're going to need for K-12.
Gentleman right here.
Dick Wright, a civil engineer. What's being done to make parents supportive of their children exploring engineering careers? It was easy for farm families, it was easy for factory families, but our demographics have changed a lot.
That's a great question. I think from an African American point of view, there are not enough role models in the African American community where they see, successful engineers. And I think that's a real big issue. So I do think that businesses have to partner with schools and bring in those role models directly into the schools. I have 2 sons and a daughter, and I try to stress to my daughter just as much as my son the need for, understanding engineering principles, science and math. But I don't think a lot of parents do that as much with their girls, versus their boys. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done in the household. But from, a minority point of view, I do believe that we need to help kids in schools because they're not getting that push necessarily at home, and they're not seeing people in their neighborhoods or around them who are engineers, who are scientists. So the schools have to do a better job of partnering with businesses, local universities. When I was in the School of Education, I was a part of NSBE, the National Society of Black Engineers, and we did programs where we brought in neighborhood students to do hands-on activities in the school. So I think colleges, businesses really need to partner with elementary schools to bring those role models into the schools and to help the students.
Could I say something?
Please.
There's kind of an interesting dissonance here because we've talked a lot about math and science as it relates to engineering, and the engineering community has done a really good job of communicating with the public about the need to know or love math and science in order to be an engineer. And as a result, for several reasons, most young people and their parents, if they understand much about engineering, and Linda alluded to this in her opening remarks, they tend to associate engineering with being really good at math and science, but not associate engineering with, I would say, the larger impact, which is making a difference in the world, creative problem solving, and so on. So some groups, including the Academy of Engineering, have tried to encourage the engineering community, broadly speaking, in its outreach, both companies, professional societies, to kind of change the language that they use when they're talking about engineering, not to be disingenuous, but to be actually more reflective of the true value, the value proposition of engineering from the point of view of a young person or a point of view of the country as a whole. So reaching influencers through mentors and other things, influencers being parents and peers and even high school counselors, is important, but the actual language that one uses is important too. And we've been encouraging the engineering community to get away from this reliance on the message about you have to love math and science. And if you don't love math and science, basically the hidden message is don't bother. And I think there's a lot of evidence that some very good engineers who were maybe didn't love math and science and maybe even weren't so great at it have turned out to be great engineers, particularly those in underrepresented groups.
I just want to support what Greg is saying, that I think we've found in some of our projects, that particularly ones that are focused on girls, that message that engineering is about trying to make a difference in the world has particular resonance.
I would just give one little plug. On your seats, you had a magnet for Ion Future, which for those of you who may be new to these salons is change the equations, game-based environment for, we targeted middle school kids, but it's free and available to anyone to explore careers. And there are 100 different STEM careers profiled, not because we think there are only 100, but a significant number of them are engineering. So for those of you who do have access to kids, I urge you to take a look at that. Other questions? Right here.
Hi, question to Arthur. I'm Robin Ree from Jack Morton. Nice to meet you. You mentioned the deep-seated notion about who can become a scientist or an engineer as one of the biggest barriers. And that's a very subtle and complex problem. Have you seen approaches that you think are effective in making a dent in that, counteracting those kinds of beliefs that children may possess about themselves?
Well, yes. We've found, we have, one of our programs is called Waterbotics. It's an underwater robotics program that we're working on right now. And we're in particular working with the National Girls Collaborative. And so they're using this curriculum in both mainly in informal circumstances, but we're also trying it in schools. But and so they're very focused on using this with girls and mainly after school and summer settings, and they've had a lot of success. And so the approach is you engage kids and you in ways that they can be successful. The other program which I know about but haven't tried is a program that is based on Carol Dweck's work called Brainology. And from what I've read about it, and I understand they've had some success, is they teach kids essentially that you can grow your brain by working at it. And so I've heard some good things about that program, although I haven't experienced it directly. But the key idea is to give kids explicit messages that about how the brain works, and that by effort and by working at it, you build connections in your brain. And so you teach them a little bit about the science of it while giving them explicit messages.
If I could just jump in for a minute, because this is the background I come from, is trying to think about how you get kids who don't naturally affiliate with STEM to think about STEM. And what we have done, because our project was really started from that premise, how do you get folks who are underserved and underrepresented engaged? And I think if they do it, they can envision themselves as being engineers. So when we began, we actually identified 14 design principles that came out of the educational literature that you can root curricular materials in. Things like they should be set in a larger context to bring this idea of who cares? How does it relate to the world around me? So there's sort of 14 that we identified. We put them out to the community. So far, we haven't had any others pop to the top. And then, tried to design a program around that. With some funding from the National Science Foundation, we're now trying to figure out, do these design principles hold? Can we sort of show through research that these are important for retaining and engaging kids from different populations, which we see as girls, kids of color, kids on underrepresented groups, English language learners, kids on individualized education plans. So I think there is literature out there. Unfortunately, it's not specific to engineering right now, so we have to borrow a lot from the science and math literature. But I think if you think very carefully from the inception about how you're going to structure the activities and the context and the materials, that there is some, research that suggests that you can make big inroads in those groups.
Another question?
Hi, good morning. Skylar Jackson, Entertainment Industries Council. And I think we had a really nice, robust conversation. My biggest question, though, is how do we take it beyond these four walls? What is the call to action and the prioritized message that we want to see reaching these engineers, these parents, and these students? And to borrow a phrase from my colleague at the end of the row, what is it that we're trying to get out to those we haven't yet thought of? For example, I'm working with television shows reaching 14 million people a day, from NCIS to Iron Man. What is the message that we say, hey, listen, if we can reach this many parents, teachers, and students every day, and we could tell them one thing to spread the collective message of this room, what would it be that we would use as mass media, the largest form of education in our culture, to help push this movement further?
I think one message is that design is everywhere. People don't think about the world around them in that way, and so the idea of engineering as either a vocation or as a way of thinking about the world is something that is understood poorly. So at least one of the messages, people need to be looking at what's around them from that engineering design perspective.
And I would refer back to the work that the National Academy of Engineering did about messaging that's particularly effective. And I think the idea that engineers, make a difference, that engineers help people is incredibly powerful. And that, I believe, is I know it's one of the top four messages, but somehow connecting that, engineers can help society is a very, very powerful one for people. In fact,
I would jump into what Christine said and try it. Try it and see if you like it. And, most of the kids, I think she mentioned, who actually come in and try and problem solve and work on a project, I think they get excited about what they're doing. So it's important for the kids to try it at an early age.
I think we have time for one more question. How about right here?
My name is Teresa Wright. I work for Montgomery County Public Schools as a parent resource teacher. And I just want to tell you something that we're doing. Of course, I agree with you, Ms. Cunningham, about the fear that they have, and the gentleman that says about the math. Every time we tell a kid, you want to be an engineer, oh, I'm not good at math, or, even the counselor says, are you going to be an engineer? You good at math? Forget about, the math. And so, but we have a partnership with Montgomery College. They have in the workforce development, we were very lucky. And we have a club that is construction and engineering. And precisely for that, in one of the classes, but we bring the parents, because you see, like you said, the parents do not know they're afraid for the kids to go, especially we work with the minorities and I work with the ESOL population. But the key is that they bring the students to talk to the parents and to the kids. So it is, they understand better, especially in the last meeting that we had, they brought a girl that was very popular in the volleyball team in this high school. So once the kids see that child that was popular and stuff is very successful in this program, they will, and also for the parents, it's very nice to see a kid that is minority and being successful. Thank you.
So I think we want to get back a little bit to that rock and lever image that we started with. because that's probably worth the last couple minutes of exploration. I will say that Christine and I were both privileged, I think you would agree with me, to serve on that 2010 report that Greg pulled together at the National Academy of Sciences. I was brought in because I bear all the scars of the standards movements in mathematics, and I learned a great deal about engineering education. But one of the phrases that I think I remember saying is, you remember that book, Everything I Ever Needed to Know I Learned in Kindergarten? There's some real truth to that message when we think about engineering education. But the reason that I cited that book title is that those of us in math education never really learned how to play well with others. And so we really want to, because our focus here is on formal education, we ought to take a little bit of a moment to talk about teachers, teacher preparation, professional development, and try to unpack that as our last note, because I think that's a very large portion of the rock.
Yes. If we look around the world at those places which seem to have made more substantial progress, at least as measured by international tests, they've all made an enormous investment in teacher preparation. It's not enough, because we have a whole lot of teachers out there who are not well informed or with respect to engineering and aren't practicing it. And so we need to kind of work on, as they say, love the one you're with idea. Dylan William uses that all the time. But we need to make an investment in teacher preparation. And so that, I think, also means making an investment in the people who are doing teacher preparation, because I think probably in the science realm, I don't know what the statistics are, but whether they have any more training in engineering or proclivities in that direction, I don't know. And so the short answer is, of course, we need to make an enormous investment in that, or we're going to be continually in a retraining cycle.
I just wanted to, our focus on teachers has, I think, pretty much exclusively been on what's called in the jargon professional development, which means working with teachers who are already teaching, with curriculum, for example, that like Christine's. But there are a handful of programs around the country now that are producing teachers out of the gate who are more, you might call them, although this hasn't actually occurred yet, STEM teachers. These are teachers often who are developing or getting a joint degree in science or sometimes engineering, and also a teaching certificate. So there are some programs that are doing this. You teach engineering at University of Texas Austin is one, but there's one at the College of New Jersey, there's one at Boise State, there's one at Colorado State University, and there are probably others. And the other thing is that there's, from the research in science education and teaching, generally speaking, there's a great appreciation for the need for teachers to have time to collaborate and plan, not just for the purposes of integrating content, but just to be good teachers, period. And that idea really is something that should get a lot more attention if we're going to be expecting teachers to either work in teams or, to work in teams around this idea of integration. They need to be given time, opportunity, and encouragement to develop sort of these communities of practice within schools.
I'm mindful of your time. I'm grateful that you chose to spend some of it with us this morning. I think our speakers will be here for a few moments for those of you who have burning questions or issues you would still like to raise. But thank you very much for coming to this salon. Do we know the date of the next one? The last week in March. How's that? To nail it down. And we'll be talking about early childhood education in the context of STEM learning. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you.